So I had a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine a few months ago, and she was telling me that she had just gotten knee surgery and she was recovering. And so, of course, I asked her, which doctor she went to and if she liked her practice and just basic questions. And it was a practice that I was actually interested in assessing. And she said, "Well, I have an interesting story for you." And I said, "Oh, well, I'd love to hear it." She said, "Well, a few years ago, I had my shoulder done by the same doctor, and I almost didn't go back." And I said, "Really?" And I said, "Did you have a bad experience?" She said, "No. I loved my doctor. I loved the practice. I loved everything about it. But when I went to schedule my knee, I couldn't get anybody to call me back. I called 2 or 3 times. I left messages. I left messages with his PA specifically. Nobody called me back. And then I couldn't schedule online. It was super frustrating. And so finally I got in my car and I drove over there and I got an appointment. And I thought to myself, how many people are going to get in their car, drive to an office and get an appointment? And she's pretty tenacious to do that. Well, come to find out, there was something going on behind the scenes in the office, and nobody had been given any direction on how to handle that doctor's patients. And so they just chose to not handle them at all. Long story short, she did end up getting her knee done there and was with the same doctor, really liked the doctor, but they almost lost a lifetime patient because their processes were so bad. Well, then to make matters worse, she was on a painkiller for her knee recovery, and it was one that they have to monitor very closely. And so they would only give her like 4 or 6 pills every time that she needed her prescription. Well, her recovery was much longer than that because she had a complete knee replacement. So every time she would need that prescription refilled, her husband would have to go to the office, get the prescription, and then take it to the pharmacy and have it filled, all because they didn't have a better process in place. So at the end of the day, she really thought twice about going there to get her second knee done. I haven't talked to her to see if that's what she decided to do, but it was unfortunate because she was in love with her doctor, loved what he did for her, was happy with the surgery, was happy with the recovery of the PT, but there were a lot of hiccups along the way, and they almost lost a patient. I'm wondering if you have the same challenge within your practice and maybe you aren't even aware of it. If we haven't met yet, I'm Elisa Connor, and I show up here every week to help both specialty medical practices and professional service organizations grow, not by outspending their competitors, but instead by creating patient and customer experiences that your patients and customers, frankly, can't wait to talk about. Somewhere inside of that practice that I just told you about, there were processes that either were not implemented or not optimized, and they nearly cost that practice at least one patient, if not more. And it was simply because the people that are supporting the doctors and the practice behind the scenes weren't giving clear direction about what to do. If that is a challenge in your practice, then that's something we're going to dive into today. So if that is the case and you've gone through change and you don't have the processes or you haven't optimized your processes for that change, it's likely that not only referrals, but also your current patients are falling through the cracks. And I want to help you identify where those places are in today's episode so that you can plug those leaks and then focus on bringing more people into your practice when you know you have a viable system that's going to nurture and care for the relationship. Nothing about my friend's care was ever in question. In fact, she was happy to go back. In fact, she loved her surgeon enough to go back for not only a second, but a third procedure. The gap wasn't clinical. The gap was around unoptimized processes and lack of clarity for the team on what to do when people were missing or the system was broken. If she wouldn't have gotten into her car and gone to book that appointment, they would have lost a patient. And it probably was more than one, because most people in that practice that were patients of that doctor likely didn't get in their car and likely went to a different practice because, as someone mentioned to me recently, Colorado has so many orthopedic surgery options, they could just go down the street to someone else. Because they didn't have a backup plan and because they didn't have a fallback system for their team, the responsibility fell on the team, who was already likely overwhelmed and had enough to do, that my friend just fell through the cracks. And I'm wondering if that same thing is happening in your practice, and what would happen if you had some sort of behind the scenes challenges going on and didn't have a process to support both your team and the transition through those challenges. Most practices don't. They don't have a backup system. They're barely holding on by a thread because they're busy, they're overwhelmed, their team is taking on more than they had ever thought that they could or would, or frankly should. And then the second gap that happened with my friend had to do with her medication. Not having a process in place that makes it easy for your patients to get their medication when they're already laid up and can't easily drive or get around because, for example, she had knee surgery. What if she didn't have somebody to get her medication refills? There has to be a better way to be able to monitor and have the prescriptions filled than having her husband drive to the office and pick up the prescription. So if this is happening in your practice, you've likely tried a few things. And the first challenge or mistake you may be making is assuming that just because a patient likes the doctor, that they're going to tolerate challenges within the practice. I had coffee with a friend of mine recently who said she was one warm referral away from leaving her dentist of 20 years. And I thought that was very interesting and it really sat with me. And I said to myself, I'm like, okay, I have multiple relationships with different doctors in my life, dentists, optometrists, different specialists. And I was like, am I also one warm referral away from leaving those practices that I've been going to for some 30 years? And I thought, yeah, I actually am. And it made me wonder if that isn't more of the majority than the minority. Because frankly, Gen X is one of the last generations to have any loyalty towards a brand or even in this case, a medical practice. Millennials and younger have zero loyalty. They will leave at the drop of a hat. And so if you're not ironing out those processes or you're just assuming that your patients are going to stick with you because they like your doctor, that's a very poor assumption to make. And it's one that your competitors are not only not making, but they don't take it lightly. The second challenge that you may not have addressed is how you're either defining or creating processes around callbacks or around unforeseen challenges in your practice that you don't know until you know. And that takes strategy and forethought because you have to think through scenarios that you thought would never happen. And most practices don't frankly have the time or the capacity to do that. And so if you don't have an outside perspective that can help you shine a light on the what ifs in your practice, you're going to be caught off guard. And then your practice and your team are going to be running to put out fires, frankly. And if you're like most other offices, you don't have the time or capacity to fight those fires. You're lucky to get through the day to day because you're likely running full throttle all day long with a team that's not only overworked and overwhelmed, but barely has time to take a lunch. And then the last part that we can learn from this story that you may or may not have been thinking about for your own practice is electronic medication. And if you haven't set up a system that offers electronic refills or monitors refills for prescriptions for your practice, that is something that can be really challenging, especially if you take into mind your patients in orthopedics specifically are in a situation where they can't get themselves to the pharmacy easily. Imagine having knee surgery and you live on your own and you don't have anybody that can go get that prescription. You either have to have somebody Uber it to you, which can be really expensive. And if you have to go to the office, you have to send that driver or somebody that you trust to get the prescription and then take it to the pharmacy and have it filled. What's the likelihood that a patient is going to go through all those extra steps the next time that they need to have a surgical procedure? Slim to none, unless they're very tenacious, like my friend was. Most other people are going to say, nope, wasn't worth it. I'm going somewhere else. So if you're not addressing those challenges and you're not thinking outside the box, you're not doing a little foreshadowing about things that could go wrong, there's some very specific reasons that you're going to want to pay attention and get some of those processes and strategy put into action before you actually need them. So chances are pretty high if you have referral patients, they're falling through the cracks in a few different spots. The first is you're not staying top of mind with them. So they've forgotten about you. They may have come in 5 years ago, 6 years ago, whatever. The latest statistic that I read was most orthopedic practices lose over half their patients every 5 years. And if that's the case, you're having to recoup all of those patients. And there's a reason that they're leaving, and it's likely because they don't remember who you are or they don't recall that they had a good experience with you. Or worse, they didn't have a good experience with you and they went and not only decided they're not coming back, but told everybody else they know that they didn't have a good experience with you. Because there is a saying, as you know, that people are more likely to complain about a situation than they are to praise it. The second thing you may be challenged with in this area is identifying and optimizing processes around unforeseen conditions. That was exactly what happened to my friend, is that she had a doctor she loved, and there were some things going on behind the scenes with not only the doctor, but also his team that were unexpected. And nobody knew what to do or how to address patients or how to manage his appointments. And because there was no clear process and no backup plan for them, they just did nothing because they didn't want to get in trouble and they didn't quite know how to handle the situation and no one was giving them direction. Without having forethought about those challenges that could appear or could show up without any warning, your practice could very much be in the same position. And that could be whether a physician leaves unexpectedly or if there is, God forbid, something that happens to one of the physicians, they are in a car accident and they can't work, whatever it might be. If you haven't thought through the what ifs from a strategic point of view and had a backup plan, that's going to be challenging for your practice. And then last but not least is making sure that your practice is up to speed with whatever technology or electronic options are available for your patients. It's no longer optional for you to not make the patient journey as smooth as possible. And the reason is very clear. You're now competing with organizations, read private equity here, that this is what they do all day long. They create, optimize, and run businesses. Unfortunately, doctors don't always have the capacity or the training to successfully operate a business. They were trained to be doctors and weren't trained to be business people. They're using that against you. And unfortunately, they're winning because you're focused on healing, which is where your focus should be. But the people that you've brought on to help you run your organization are also focused on healing. They're not focused on creating a profitable, optimized organization that runs smoothly behind the scenes. That's no fault of their own either, but it is solvable. And the best way to solve that is to bring in an outside perspective who does know business and does know how things should operate and doesn't necessarily get caught up in the way that medical practices have always run. Because the world is changing fast. And if you're not keeping up with it, you're not going to keep up with it at all. So what do the practices that do this differently, what does it look like for them? And how can you compete? Because that's really the question. For sure, those private equity organizations have processes that are mapped out. They've optimized them over and over again. They have assigned the process and the responsibility for every single part of the patient journey to a team member. And they've made it run very effectively and efficiently. But what they've removed is the patient experience. If you have questions and you want things answered or you want a little extra time with your doctor, nope, we don't do that anymore. You get 10 minutes. Because at the end of the day, those private equity corporations have one goal. It's to make money. If you're not creating a profit for them, they'll sell you off to someone else. And ultimately, if you don't make a profit for the next person, you won't be in business anymore. So the sad part of this is that, yes, they can help you optimize your processes and take over the business role, but they also take away your ability to do medicine the way you want to do it, which is why you see doctors flying in groves away from these private equity corporations. They don't like it. They don't like the schedules. They feel tied to what the corporation wants, and they don't feel like they can be doctors anymore. But there is the opportunity for you to not have to choose between corporation and doing things the way you're doing them right now, which is not helping your practice thrive. One of the most effective things you can do to grow your practice is to create processes, optimize those processes if you already have them, and then assign responsibility of those processes to specific people. And I would say more than one person, because what happens if one person owns the process and they leave? The process has changed, all of that knowledge walks out the door with them. And practices find this happening often, especially if it's an administrative person who's responsible for patient intake and seeing those new patients front and center. Those people get burned out really quickly because their desk is a dumping ground for everything that needs to be done that nobody else has time for. So, as you know, if you tune into these episodes, we always do what I call practice math. And I call it practice math because it helps it to become applicable to you and your practice very quickly. And you can see the dollar amounts that are walking out the door, frankly, if you don't address the challenges that we talk about in every episode. And in this one, it's having the right processes in place so that your previous patients and new and referral patients aren't on the struggle bus to try and get in and work with your practice. If you were to lose just one long-term patient a month, we'll use my friend as an example. If they were to lose her as a patient and everyone, one person a month just like her, they're not only losing out on 2 surgical procedures, but they're also losing out on all of the peripheral services that go with that, including physical therapy, imaging, follow-up appointments, all of those different things that practices can charge for. At an average of $6,500 per surgery, and she had 2 of them, that's $13,000. And then another $3,500 in downstream revenue for each of those surgeries. That's another $7,000. That's $20,000 a patient. So if doctors see roughly 300 patients a month and they're losing out on half, we're going to do even a smaller amount. We're going to do 20% because I like to be conservative in my math. That's 10 patients a month times $10,000 at a minimum. If they come back for more surgery, it's more than that, but that's $100,000 a month times 12 months is $1.2 million a year that your practice is losing out on. And that's per physician. If you have what some of these practices that I look at have 45 physicians, that's multiply that number times 45. That's an incredible amount of money that is walking out the door for people that are already loyal to you, that have already come to be part of your practice. They're happy with the doctor and they're happy with the results you got them. And they're just floating out the door because there's a few things that haven't happened. One, you're not following up with those patients to keep top of mind. And 2, when they do come back, they're running into endless friction to try and work with you. If that's the case, then it's no wonder you have to spend so much money on marketing because you're trying to get more people in the door all the time instead of staying in front of the people who are already your advocates. The other unwritten part of this is that those advocates also become your best referral partners. Yes, you can wait for referrals to come in from your existing physician partners, but if you have somebody that's an advocate of your practice, they're going to tell every single person they know. And every person probably knows at least 10 people So even if half of those people come in, that is the quickest way to grow your practice. And it's the most economical way to grow your practice because it's free marketing. But you have to stay top of mind with them and you have to keep your reputation top notch for them, not in a position where they're ready to trade you in for the next warm referral. So if you tune into this show regularly, you know that I always give you an action plan. This week is no different, and I try to give you 3 steps that you can implement so that you can start to see traction and also start to smooth out and optimize processes so that you're not losing referral patients or new patients or current patients in this case. So the first step to your action plan this week is to audit your current patient process. What do you do with existing patients? Do you just get them to a certain point in the process and then hope and pray they come back? How's that hope and pray method working for you? If that's your methodology, how's it working for you? My best guess is it's not working for you at all. And if you do have a process, when was the last time that you audited it? If you haven't done that recently, then step number 1 is perfect for you. Go and audit that process. And if you don't have a process, start asking why. And what are you going to do about that process? Because it's really important. Step number 2 is once you've audited, whether you have a process or don't have a process, is to start to optimize just the existing patient process. What happens to existing patients once they complete their treatment? Do you stay in touch with them? How are you staying in touch with them? How often are you staying in touch with them? And what would the ideal world look like for an existing patient to get them to come back to your practice for their next surgical procedure or to refer their friend or whatever it might be, whatever activity that is that you decide, what would the process have to look like? And what is the goal? And is it both of those goals? And then the third step of this process is how are you going to measure this when you implement it? Because nothing will happen if you create a process and don't start to implement it. So you need to think about who's going to own it and then how are you going to measure the success of those returning patients. And success can be a couple of different ways. It could be, do they come back for another procedure or how many people are they sending your way? And are you tracking it? Because most practices don't. They don't track either of those things. So if you can differentiate your practice in that way and focus on the patient and how it looks from the patient end of things, you're immediately going to be different than your competitors. And that includes those big private equity corporations, for sure. I always hear we can't compete with them. We don't have the budget. We don't have the marketing bandwidth that they have. But what you do have is the ability to treat people like people. And that's becoming more and more important as time goes on. If you are struggling with even doing the audit or figuring out where to start with this, the perfect way to get started on not only this, but identifying your 3 biggest leaks in your practice are by having a triage call with me. It's 20 minutes. We sit down. I help you identify your 3 biggest leaks and then give you 3 steps to close one of them within 30 to 60 days. The link for that call is below the video, in the video description, and also in the podcast description. Thank you so much for tuning in this week and for sticking with me. If you found value in this episode, I would love for you to share it with someone else. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.